The shape of human history is so weird. You just plot some simple graphs, like, for example, growth of world population, growth of world GDP, increase in greenhouse gas emissions. And the shape of all those graphs is very similar, right? It's the same hockey stick graph. It all starts around 7050. That's really when history starts. And we're still in this rocket ship that is accelerating. And we get to see probably how this story ends. And it could end really, really badly. And it could end really, really well. And the outcome is probably going to be determined by a small group of really agentic entrepreneurial people who don't just complain and whine and moan, but who are like, you know what? I can find myself a small group of committed people, a cult, if you will, and make a difference and make a change.
Today's guest has sold over 2 million books in a range of different languages. They're probably one of the most successful non-fiction writers out there. They're a historian, a public intellectual, if you will, and they're best known for this clip.
I mean, I hear people talk in the language of participation and justice and equality and transparency. But then, I mean, almost no one raises the real issue of tax avoidance, right? And of the rich just not paying their fair share. I mean, it feels like I'm at a firefighters conference and no one's allowed to speak about water. I mean, this is not rocket science. I mean, we can talk for a very long time about all these stupid philanthropy schemes. We can invite Bono once more, but come on, we gotta be talking about taxes. Yeah, exactly. That's it, taxes, taxes, taxes. All the rest is bullshit, in my opinion.
But looking back over the last 10 years, maybe certain kinds of activism simply haven't worked. Maybe now is the time to take account, take stock of where we really are and whether things like awareness raising are adequate or sufficient. Today's guest thinks not. His latest book, Moral Ambition, is an indictment on precisely that approach and a call for a left that doesn't just talk and critique, but also does and builds. Rutger Bregman, welcome to Downstream.
Great to see you again.
Well, welcome back.
Yeah, this is the third time now, right?
Yeah. I think the first time was, 2018?
Yeah, something like that. We already talked about the waste of talent back then and people wasting their careers in finance and consultancy and corporate law. But now we're going to talk about how we can actually do something about it.
Yeah. Your first book, Utopia for Realists, was that 2013?
I wrote it actually in 2013. Indeed, it came out in 2014 in the Netherlands, but then it took me some time to get the English edition out. That was 2017.
Yeah. But that's a really long time ago when you think about it.
Yeah, it was such a different time in politics. My main complaint back then was that we didn't really have a dream anymore. Didn't really have anything worth fighting anymore for. So the great milestones of civilization, the end of slavery, democracy, equal rights for men and women, these were all utopian fantasies once. And it felt to me that the left only knew what it was against, right? Against austerity at the time, against the establishment, against growth. And Utopia for Realists was an attempt to unlock the windows of thought, and of dreaming. Universal basic income was one of the ideas I was really excited about at the time. There was a whole chapter about the rise of the robots, which seems even more relevant today, with the rise of AI taking our jobs. But it was a happier, more relaxed, and in a way also a more boring time in politics.
So Utopia for Realists comes out in English in 2017. You then write Humankind, and now you're on to a third book, which is pretty much the base of our conversation today, although I'm going to start with a question on Utopia for Realists. Moral ambition. Stop wasting your talent and start making a difference. As you've said, something you've thought about for a very long time. But let's start with Utopia for Realists. This really big breakthrough book, not just for people on the left, but I think also people on the centre right, liberals, all sorts of people suddenly were grappling with really, really big ideas in a way they hadn't done for a very long time. We discussed that book a few years ago. I always love asking these questions. What were you wrong about in that book?
Oh, quite a few things. I think the main thing was how easy it would be to convince people that universal basic income is the way. We've made some progress. So in the last decade, we have seen a lot of basic income experiments. At some point, there were so many basic income experiments in the United States, giving people basically cash so that they can decide for themselves how they want to help themselves. At some point, I joked to some of my friends, like, oh, if it keeps going like this, everyone will be in a basic income pilot. But apart from that, politically, we haven't made much progress. And we've also seen some recent evidence that was a bit less positive, I would say, about basic income. So there was a big study actually financed by Sam Altman from OpenAI, very rigorous study that still showed positive results, but not as positive as some of the studies that I quoted in Utopia for Realists. I think the most positive results actually have been coming out of poorer and middle income countries, where I still think it makes so much sense. Like if you want to do something like development aid, and no one does want to do that anymore, sadly, but if you want to, then yeah, you always got to ask yourself the question, why not just, give the salaries of the people who, pretend to help those poorer people. Cash should always be the benchmark. You got to come up with a really good idea, but yeah, just start with cash. So I think that idea has survived. Yeah, some new studies, as I said, were less positive than I anticipated.
So you said two things there. You were wrong about how quickly it may be adopted, but you were maybe also wrong about the efficacy of UBI in high-income countries, it sounds, maybe?
Yes, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you think that UBI...
Which, it depends on the goal, right? So don't get me wrong, I'm still really excited about universal basic income. There's a lot to be said for it, especially in an era of automation. If it's really true that the robots now are finally going to take all of our jobs, and I see increasing signs of it, I am utterly amazed by the power of these large language models. As a writer, I'm amazed every single day. People who are still saying that this is like crypto, which is pretty useless. They've really lost the plot. It's an incredibly powerful technology and getting better every single week, every single day. So yeah, it becomes more and more believable and imaginable to me that we will see a rapid pace of automation. And then obviously universal basic income will come back on the table, right? It's a very sensible and logical option. And then it also doesn't really matter all that much if people will do a little bit less of paid work. It sort of becomes the point, actually. Then actually what people in the 60s and the 70s were already thinking about, that the great challenge of the future would be boredom, then that will finally arrive. And that indeed will be the thing we will have to solve. Like, what is the good life if we don't have paid work anymore?
Do you think that democracies now in the 21st century are capable of overseeing a policy change that big? You mentioned the 60s. There are huge policy shifts in the 60s and the 50s, and that happened in democracies, Lyndon Johnson, post-war Britain, post-war Netherlands, Europe, etc. But it's something I've been thinking about really over the last decade, basically since you've been on the scene talking about these really big ideas. Maybe liberal democracies as we know them in Western Europe and North America, maybe they can't do stuff this big anymore for whatever reason, and we can debate that. What's your sense on that? Because there is this feeling of sort of political inertia, inability to solve big problems when it comes to the major liberal democracies.
Well, it depends on what we want here. I think especially as the development of AI accelerates, the main thing we want to do is to slow it down, probably, right? To give society some breathing room, to give it some ability to adjust. Is that possible? Yeah, it's definitely possible. The EU, for example, has been really great at slowing innovation down, sometimes, with not great consequences. But I think that's definitely possible. I co-founded an organization called the School for Moral Ambition that helps really talented people to work on some of the most pressing issues. One of my co-founders actually got started I like to see him as the Robin Hood of talent. And he was taking away tech talent out of Silicon Valley, transporting them to Brussels, and then helping them to lobby for a better AI Act, basically lobby against big tech. And I think they basically won that fight. So it is possible, but obviously most of the AI companies currently are in the US, and it becomes increasingly hard perhaps to regulate them. There was also a kind of fantasy among some people, for example, in the effective altruism community, who thought, if it's mostly our people working at those companies, very aligned people, then surely everything will turn out to be fine. But now we see, obviously, with OpenAI as the prime example, is that still the dynamic of the race, just the desire to get there first and also beat China perhaps, is much more powerful. So I don't know. I'm pretty worried about it. I don't have happy things to say about it, I'm afraid. What do you think?
It's one of the big things that's changed in the last 10 years. I actually think, our first conversation and then this conversation are such good sort of bookends here because so much has changed. Like the AI and automation stuff is just immeasurably different. And the geopolitical side is really different. People were talking about China being a quote unquote threat or a rival, but it was always in the distant future. And I think now, particularly post electric vehicles and DeepSeek, I think quite influential, powerful people are going, okay, wow, we're kind of losing the cutting edge here. And I think that's a big question. I think I like living in democracy, don't get me wrong. I'm not pro-autocracy, but I think it's just such a huge challenge to anybody who believes in democracy that you have this other country making massive technological breakthroughs, still not the technological leader, but it could be.
Here's the thing we need to reckon with on the left. Can we still build? Take a simple thing like affordable housing, right? A lot of my leftist friends will say, oh, it's all the fault of BlackRock. It's all the fault of these speculative investors and bankers. They're hoarding all the housing. And look, I think that's just an utterly unserious analysis. If you look at the housing market, it's one of the most regulated markets that we have out there. And it's basically a game of musical chairs with not enough chairs. Now, many entrepreneurs that I know would love to build more chairs, actually, because they can make quite a bit of money on it. Why is it not happening? Because it is illegal. Because we have lots of regulations from the 60s, from the 70s, that are now being abused by NIMBYs, not in my backyard people. And that makes it really difficult to build. It's happening everywhere. It's happening in the US, obviously. It's happening in the UK. It's also happening in the Netherlands. We now have the so-called nitrogen crisis. It's basically become illegal to emit even a tiny little bit of nitrogen because that's bad for biodiversity. It's a kind of, someone recently called it liberal legalism, right? Using the power of law and of the courts to block all building. And then we're back to that problem I already talked about in Utopia for Realists. It's not enough to say no all the time. We got to get much better at actually saying yes. So take the climate movement, for example. Historically, the climate movement was really good and is still really good at saying no. And that was very necessary in the 60s and the 70s when rivers were being polluted, when the air was so dirty, when highways were being plowed through neighborhoods, right? So we needed people like in the US, for example, Ralph Nader, who recruited these brilliant law school students, Nader's Raiders as they were called, and they influenced the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. That was very necessary at the time. But today I feel we pretty much need the opposite. We need a group of raiders who actually take down a lot of red tape. And then people say, Rutger, you sound like a neoliberal now. No, not at all. I am just an old-fashioned social democrat who thinks we got to build. We got to build that housing. We got to build that clean energy. And I think it's quite an indictment of the current system we have that very often is only possible when we declare a state of emergency. So in the US, you saw that famous example when Josh Shapiro, the governor, was finally able to build this big bridge that had collapsed. Why was he able to do it? State of emergency. We saw the same thing when the Russians invaded Europe and we had this big need for LNG gas terminals. Suddenly we were able to do it in just a couple of months. Apparently we can still build. Why did we do it? State of emergency. So yeah, that's the big reckoning that needs to happen on the left right now. We totally need to reorient our politics towards saying yes, building things, creating things, instead of standing in the way and blocking everything.
Yeah, the point I made about China before, which I kind of am inclined to believe right now, the counter-argument comes from, of course, the response to COVID in countries like the US, UK, developing, others too, right? Cuba, Vietnam, developing their own vaccines just as quickly as China. And so that's a good counter-argument, and I kind of buy it, and I agree with you. When the stakes are that high, there's a state of emergency, there's a response from different kinds of state, which are quite effective. I agree with that entirely. So just to synthesize this and condense it all down, you would agree with the abundance agenda of somebody like Ezra Klein, who says build, supply side, liberalism, as he might call it, supply side progressivism. And you would maybe disagree with somebody like Gary Stevenson, who's saying that right now the problem is the wealthy have loads of extra capital, which means they can buy more assets, which makes those assets more expensive, which means you don't have access to those assets like housing, etc. So you're more sympathetic to Ezra than to Gary. Not that you disagree with Gary entirely, but
I love both of them.
Yeah.
I think Gary is doing fantastic work
yeah.
by raising the issue of the utter unfairness of the current tax system. And I think that's desperately needed. As you know, this has been something I've been going on about for a very long time. We need much higher taxes on the wealthy, especially, by the way, in the era of AI. It becomes much more important to have higher taxes on capital instead of labor. In terms of, the housing crisis, I find it hard to say how that could be true. Like, it's pretty clear to me. If you just look at maybe particularly so in this country, like, there are just not enough houses. You just need to build more. Why doesn't that happen? A lot of entrepreneurs, we can agree on that, right? They would love to make money on it, but they can't because there's so much red tape, there's so much regulation. Then you try something and then there's immediately a lawsuit against you. So I think you can be both. You can be in favor of a pretty radical redistributive agenda with much higher taxes on the wealthy, and that's, by the way, something that the vast majority of people across the Western world are in favor of. But you can also be in favor of a liberalism that builds, because then we can actually use that money raised from the wealthy to build stuff. Noah Smith, who is a blogger that I really like, he often talks about Czechism. He says that there's a tendency among the left to say, oh, if we just have this amount of money, like, I don't know, 10 billion, 50 billion, 100 billion, and then we use that to build affordable housing and clean energy, blah, 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 then that's when we won the fight. No, not at all. I mean, look, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson have this example of high-speed rail in California. They spent tens of billions of dollars on it. Well, it's still not there. And in the meantime, China built 25,000 kilometers of it. Yeah. Obviously, we don't need to go all the way to China. There are beautiful examples in our own history of times when we were able to build, when we built, a highway system, when we expanded the energy system. In my own country, we discovered natural gas in the north of the country in the 60s, and it took just a couple of years to connect pretty much all households to it. So, and this was a democracy at the time, it was not some kind of fascist autocracy or anything like that. So I don't like that dichotomy that you have to go all the way to China in order to be able to do something. That's not true.
No, I think there's something to that. So you said you've been accused of being a neoliberal. Do you think we should shrink the state in certain aspects? Do you believe in a smaller state?
So I've said in the past that I believe in something you could call an anarchist state. When it comes to poverty, for example, I am very skeptical of the whole industry of care workers and well-intentioned paternalists who are trying to teach people how to live their lives. I am a big believer in human autonomy. I think that the real experts on the poor's lives are the poor themselves. So this goes back to my advocacy for basic income or just cash transfers. I would much rather just give money to the poor instead of providing all these, therapeutic services. So in that way, I would shrink the state. Also, in terms of security and police and surveillance, I would definitely shrink the state. I mean, we often say that right-wingers are in favor of a small state. Well, not when it comes to controlling people, right? There's another organization that I've written about in Dutch healthcare that I really love. It's called Buurtzorg. It's financed with taxpayers' money, but it's organized almost like an anarchist commune or co-op. So it doesn't really have managers. It has self-directed teams of nurses who decide for themselves whom they want to hire, what kind of additional education they need. And again, the consultants, the McKinseys of the Netherlands, they do their analyses of this particular organization. And again, they discover, they're cheaper, they're better for our clients, and people love working there. Well, they get a higher salary than at the competitors because they've cut out many of the management layers. That's an example of this anarchist state, right? You're using public money to give professionals the means to do their job and do it really well.
This, for me, is a really, really important political point. So I think what's emerging is actually some kind of a consensus on both the left and the right, for different reasons, with different conclusions, that the administrative state, the 20th century, early 21st century administrative state isn't working, right? In a ton of ways. You see it with Doge. In a weird way, you obviously see it with austerity after 2010 in this country. And I think there's a left-wing critique of it as well. If I was to say to you, Rutger, we're going to increase in this country, and I know you're not as familiar with British politics as you are Dutch politics, but Rutger, we're going to let you increase taxes. You can increase capital gains and all that stuff. Don't worry about that. But we also want you to find 10 to 15 billion pounds worth of cuts to the administrative state. Because I'm just trying to put some figures on it, really. Do you think that's something that you could do? You think there's lots of money that's being wasted by central government that could go elsewhere?
Yeah, I think probably so, yeah. Maybe especially in terms of how judicial everything has become. So I really don't like what Doge is doing, but there was something to be said for the idea that the system needed a shock. It had become almost impossible to hire talented people, for example, in the US, because everything had become so incredibly bureaucratic, and you had to check so many marks. So that is a question that really fascinates me. How do we move towards a government that is able to attract really talented, the so-called best and brightest, to work on some of those most pressing issues? We used to live in that world. So in the 60s and the 70s, it was much more normal if you went to Harvard or Yale or Princeton or Oxford that you would go and work for the government, because you could still build there. Why do so many people today go and work as a quant, in the city? Or why did they go and work for Silicon Valley? Well, because it's easier to build there. In the digital world, obviously, you can still build. There's no, or much less red tape there. So that is a question that people on the left need to think really hard about. Like, how do we make it much more attractive? And that's not just about raising taxes. It will obviously help, because then you can provide more decent salaries and money matters. So that will definitely help. But you also got to make these jobs more exciting. Give people the feeling that there's actually something to be done here, to be built. That's essential.
Yeah. I mean, again, to go back to China, and this isn't a left-right thing, it's not a communist market capitalist thing. When people are in charge of the local authority, like a city in China, the city mayor, who's a member of the Chinese Communist Party, they're judged on a bunch of outcomes and outputs. And you compare it to how local authorities are run in this country, and I think, my goodness, we've got so much to learn. People who will work in local government for 20, 30 years, they are passengers. I don't mean to be horrible to them, but they're passengers. The culture of those organizations tend to be inertia, not doing anything, not solving problems, no oomph. Mm-hmm. And I think because, like you say, people with that kind of oomph tend not to go into those industries anymore.
Another thing that's maybe difficult to acknowledge for those of us among the left is that there are big differences in how effective and how talented people are. That is, I've started this organization myself, so you start to have some experience as an entrepreneur. I think this point is also very effectively made by someone like Peter Thiel, quite controversial man, but an utterly brilliant book, 0 to 1, about startups and how to build a company. And he makes this point that the world of talent is also shaped by power laws, right? So some people are not like 2 or 3 times as effective or entrepreneurial as others. But yeah, honestly, more like 100 or 1,000 times. And I think any entrepreneur watching this will recognize this. Like, sometimes you just have people who just get so much done. And how do you attract those people? That is very important. Money plays a bit of a role, but I think much more important is status and prestige. Like, what is the coolest thing? Where do you really want to be right now? In my book, I write a lot about the British abolitionist movement. I had this epiphany when I discovered that abolitionism was pretty much a failure everywhere. So in the Netherlands, where I'm from, we had a bunch of, Calvinist social justice warriors who mainly preached to each other.
Those 2 words together, Calvinist social justice.
Yeah, well, they behave like that.
Yeah.
They really got nothing done. In France, you had a bunch of writers and intellectuals. Well, you can expect that they didn't achieve much either. In Spain and Portugal, there was nothing. But in Britain, you had the 12 founders of the British Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. One was a writer, one was, a lawyer, but then 10 out of 12 were entrepreneurs, people who had built their own companies and had scaled those companies, who knew what it took to build something, to go from 0 to 1, as Peter Thiel would say. And they saw abolitionism as a part of a much bigger project. So if you would have asked someone like William Wilberforce, who was a very annoying figure in many respects, but if you would have asked him, what was your life's mission? He would have said, making doing good more fashionable. For him, it was about providing a different way of living your life, bringing virtue back in vogue. That's also what you see when you study the biography of someone like Thomas Clarkson, my favorite abolitionist. I think we need something similar today. Just screaming at people saying, oh, you're so bad, you're so immoral, why don't you do more good for the world? It's probably not enough, right? I think we got to find ways to build magnets for talented people to make it more attractive to work on those things. And honestly, that is not just about money. I think smart people, talented, driven people want to work with other smart, talented, driven people. And we can keep dunking on those bankers. And I've done that a lot in my career, as you know. But at some point, you also got to zoom out and look at the whole system like a sociologist or an anthropologist and think like, what's happening here? What are they getting over there that they're not getting over here?
Yeah.
And if you say, oh, it's only about the money, sorry, but that's just a shallow analysis.
Yeah.
There's much more at play here.
Yeah. So, I mean, a great response to that is the military. If you look at the Royal Navy or the US Navy or the Army, you have a pay differential from highest to lowest earner in those organizations generally around 10 to 1. But the point is, if you're an admiral in the Royal Navy, you're a big shot. You get to have dinner with these people. Everybody looks up at you. You have, like you say, prestige and so on. You earn good money as well, but not crazy money compared to the lowest income people in the organization. So there's something to that. There's a few things I want to respond to because I think you said about learnings as an entrepreneur. The thing I've learned at Novara Media is you can't scale people. You can scale loads of stuff. If Novara Media got £1 million tomorrow, if we had a bunch of new supporters, support Novara Media, go to novaramedia.com/support, we could scale the building, right? We would literally, what we spend on rent, you can times it by 10, you get 10 times the surface area, or maybe actually more, but whatever. 10 times the computing power, 10 times the cameras. But it's really hard to scale people. Can I get 2 Ash Sarkers, 3 Ash Sarkers? Can I get 4 Cessis, knowing what Cessi does? It's very, very hard, actually. And I think the left doesn't really necessarily grasp that very often.
Yeah. In the book, I really grapple with that question, like, how important are individuals? And I'm very familiar with the standard critique of all these self-help books. We on the left, we like to say, oh, that's just neoliberal BS, the pull yourself up by your bootstraps nonsense. That's just an excuse for the existing inequality, which I strongly agree with that analysis. On the other hand, there's also something that I like to describe as the left-wing excuse, right? Where you keep saying, oh, change the system, overthrow capitalism, kill the patriarchy, and not really look in the mirror, not really think about what you can do yourself. In the book, I keep coming back to that quote from Margaret Mead, who said that it's small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens that change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. What I see there is a recognition that indeed individuals, small groups of individuals, if they come together, they can have a massive difference, or they can make a massive difference. And if you don't believe so, then I think that's actually a very atomistic, individualistic view of what humans are, because then you would assume that we're just islands who can't influence others, right? And it's just something that also bugs me is that you have a lot of people right now dunking on someone like Elon Musk, saying, "Oh, he's not smart. He's actually really stupid. He became rich because he got all these government subsidies." I'm like, sorry, that is really not the case. If you can't see that this is an utterly brilliant entrepreneur, also an utterly immoral entrepreneur right now, obviously, but he's utterly brilliant. He's incredibly effective. I mean, what a builder. And also, what a gift to the climate movement he initially gave with accelerating that transition towards electric cars. And how sad that he now has gone utterly nuts. But if you really say like, oh, he's just stupid, then I don't know.
Well, in a way, I think he still is a gift to the climate movement, because now you've got loads of conservatives who don't believe in climate change buying Teslas because the left is coming after Elon Musk.
That's
which,
true.
Worse things could happen.
Another great gift he's given to progressives is that he bought Twitter. And Twitter was the echo chamber where a lot of us went nuts. But now, he's pretty much destroyed it. And I think that has led to a much more reasonable common sense environment among the left. It's
I
very
agree
good
with
that
you.
we don't have Twitter anymore.
I agree. No, I think long term, I think it's going to be a real benefit to progressives and to the left. I entirely agree with you. I think Elon Musk is clearly a very intelligent man. Somebody might say, well, SpaceX is run by the chief operations officer. I can't remember who it is at SpaceX. It's a woman in her 40s, very, very capable woman. Okay, but he had the intelligence to hire the right person for the right job. That in itself is an aptitude. Oh, he's just a self-publicist. Again, that's he's good at it, right? He's good at several things.
And he's doing really, can we please acknowledge that is really fucking cool to build spaceships that go to space. That is like... I still have that little boy in me who's like rooting for SpaceX whenever I see those videos. And I feel sad about it as well because, Mr. Musk has lost the plot. And I think that we could have lived in a different world where this is, the government able to attract that talent and do it in the name of us all and be maybe even more ambitious about it. I'm very sad that we live in a world where billionaires are doing this.
Yeah.
But can we please still recognize that it's pretty cool to go to space? Like,
yeah. It's technically quite difficult to launch a rocket and to land it again.
Exactly.
On that point, I think Ezra Klein said this. So the sort of emblem of the left in the 30s was the city bureaucrat, the trade union leader, the working man or woman. And that's what you think about the left, right? People physically making stuff with their hands or organizing, a large authority. I don't like what he did with the car system, something like Robert Moses. He made modern New York. And then that is what the left, socialists, social democrats wanted to achieve in the first half of the 20th century. And then the image of the left, so far this century, but definitely in the final decades of the last century, the image of the left was the protester, the person outside the building. Like you say, don't do this or do this. And sometimes that's really important, by the way, but that's a major shift politically, right? From one to the other.
Yeah. And the incredible focus on language fits here, right? It's like use the right words to describe all the injustices in the world, which is like an utterly ambitious attitude, I would say, to actually wanting to make this world a better place.
Well, let's go to this book. And I've got a few more questions from before this in my notes, but we'll go with this to pick up on your point there. You've got a great sentence in Moral Ambition. Modern protest sometimes seems little more than a collection of clicks and likes in the hope someone higher up will notice. So what moved you to write that sentence? Was there a particular thing you were seeing or listening to as you were writing the book that made you come up with that conclusion?
Well, honestly, also a certain frustration with myself. A lot of people will know me for saying some nasty things about billionaires in Davos in 2019. And I had a lot of fun with that, shouting Texas, Texas, Texas at a bunch of billionaires. But that is just play in a way. It's not real politics. Maybe it helps a little bit in raising awareness. But you got to have a plan of how to actually get power, how to actually influence legislation. You got to know a lot about the intricacies of tax policies. We all know that taxes get complicated very quickly and that the other side has an army of lawyers and accountants, at their disposal to make sure they pay as little in tax as possible. So, in the book, I'm also talking to myself. I wanted to quit the quote unquote awareness industry, writing articles, writing books, standing on the sidelines, expressing my opinion, hoping that some other people would do the actual work of making this world a better place. As you know, I was quite inspired by what Ralph Nader did in the 60s and the 70s, the so-called Nader's Raiders. Lots of Ivy League graduates who chose not to go and work for these big corporate law firms, but instead went to Washington to lobby for more effective regulation of these corporations, which was very necessary at the time, as the rivers were being polluted and the air was very dirty. And I thought, can't we replicate that? Can't we, again, build a magnet for very talented people? Maybe we can start with a campaign on Wall Street with billboards that say, if you're so smart, then why do you work here? Why do you live such boring lives, right? You could go on and do great things. So that's what we're currently doing, actually. We are building a fellowship for tax fairness. We are recruiting wealth managers, bankers, corporate lawyers, really the best of the best to understand everything about how the system actually works, and then use that knowledge to lobby for a much more reasonable tax system where billionaires actually have an effective tax rate that is, as high as middle-class people, maybe a little bit higher, but don't want to be too radical. Yeah, that's really the next step in my career, at least. So that's the reason I wanted to write this book. Is I thought, you know what, Rutger, got to do something finally.
I can see the YouTube title now: "How I Quit the Awareness Industry."
Yeah.
But this is really interesting because we've talked and we've criticized many times the likes of corporate lawyers, consultants, etc. I wonder, is media also part of the problem? Should I and Ash Sarkar, should we quit Novara Media and should we become quantity surveyors, work out how many bricks and how much mortar and how many tiles and how many solar panels are needed to build a residential development up the road? I mean, there is the yapping industry, right? Which is the media, and it is yapping.
Yeah.
Do you think as well there's too many intelligent, talented people going into that when they could be going elsewhere?
Well, it seems to me that you guys at Novara are pretty focused, right? You have a project, you have a plan, unlike a lot of other journalists. Journalists, in a way, are very similar to consultants. They very often don't believe anything themselves. They jump from project to project. They write an article about this, they write an article about that. They have a lack of what Nassim Nicholas Taleb would call skin in the game, right? And we always have to be very wary when people don't have skin in the game, when they don't pay a price for making mistakes. The great thing about a lot of people in essential jobs is that when they mess up, when your nurse messes up, when your barista messes up, when the teacher, you notice. But the thing with many consultants and also a lot of journalists is like they've already moved on to something else and they don't pay the price there for their mistakes. Maybe that's a bit different for you. I don't know. You have to answer the question.
Well, it's a really interesting point. So, I mean, Gary Stevenson has said this, right? He said, as a trader, if I make the wrong call about interest rates this year and I'm making a bet one way and things go another way, I lose money.
Yeah.
But if I'm an economics journalist writing for The Guardian saying, or a columnist, I think this will happen and I'm wrong.
Exactly.
No skin in the game.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's really interesting. And you're right. I mean, most journalists don't have skin in the game like, practitioners. And it's really interesting the way, again, Gary phrases it, the 10,000 best economists in the world, 9,500 of them you never would have heard of because they're making a ton of money. That's what they want to do. If you're really that smart and well equipped to understand, 21st century global political economy, all the variables, all the political risk, all that, blah, 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 you're not going to write as a freelancer for The Guardian, £400 an article. You're going to bet on it. So I think there's something to that.
About awareness, it really depends. So at the School for Moral Ambition, this organization I co-founded, we asked a bunch of researchers to say what the cause areas should be that we got to work on. We said, we're looking for the most sizable, the most solvable, and the most sorely neglected issues where a small group, a SWAT team of very driven entrepreneurial people can make a massive difference. So they did 1,000 hours of research, spoke to a lot of experts and came back to us and said, look, in Europe, if you want to do policy entrepreneurship in Brussels, then probably fighting big tobacco is one of the best returns on investments. That's where you can make the biggest possible impact, which was a big surprise for me. I thought, that we had already basically won that fight, that smoking was already declining. Turns out not to be the case. It's the single largest preventable cause of disease. If you care just about people dying, it's like orders of magnitude bigger than something like climate change, for example. So natural disasters is 60,000 deaths every year. Smoking is 8 million deaths every year. It's quite astonishing. And they've created the deadliest product in the history of civilization. Very smart people, by the way, have been working very long and hard to make it as addictive as possible. Now, what we discovered here is that, indeed, there was a total lack of awareness. So we've been recruiting marketeers and people who understand how to tell a good story to raise the saliency of this. But when I look at some other cause areas, take tax fairness and tax justice, for example, my analysis is different. I think that we've already won the fight for awareness. The vast majority of people already agree. Polling around the globe shows this. 70 to 80% of people in the US, in the UK, in Europe, they want higher taxes on the rich. So I think that people like Gary do a great job and provide a great public service when they keep banging the drum and they force other journalists to also talk more about it. That is definitely helpful. But we also got to think hard about what is the next step here, right? How do we move from awareness to action? How do we actually build the right coalitions? How do we get the right people in the right room at the right time? Is it the OECD, the think tank in Paris? Do we need a couple of radical nerds there? Is it the IMF? Do we need to place people there? But then you need to have a very deep understanding of the system. This is one of those things that I liked about Ralph Nader. He would always emphasize that as soon as you start dozing off, and you think, oh, this is getting too complicated or bureaucratic or boring, that's where the money is, right? That's where the rich make the money. And so that's when we got to pay attention. And sure, it's exciting. It's more interesting to go to Davos and shout taxes, taxes, taxes. But that's the easy bit.
See, everything you're saying, it sounds to me like a kind of Leninism, right? And I know you would never use that language, and I don't think necessarily even thinking in those terms.
Yeah.
But you're saying
I see what you're getting at.
Effectively, and it doesn't have to be, democratic centralism. You effectively want to build a party of highly competent, talented, effective people to shift various debates in civil society, but also beyond the debates, actually catalyze action in different industries and different fields. And I think 100 years ago, somebody like Lenin would have said, yes, Rutger, that's building the party. Yeah. So I wonder, what's the relationship like between the stuff you're talking about, which I think most people would agree with and find it very exciting. What's the relationship between that stuff and actually the sort of the perennial questions of politics, like seizing state power, political power, building the party, etc.? Is there a relationship there? Is it something you think actually, I would quite like social democratic left-wing party in the Netherlands to have all these really clever people pile into it, but also still doing their jobs beyond politics? Or is that looking at things in a very limited way?
So let me first emphasize that anyone can be morally ambitious. This is not just for Oxbridge graduates or something like that. I do spend a lot of time in my book punching up at those people who shouldn't just check their privilege, but also use it to make a big difference. But look, we all know that, Rosa Parks was a seamstress and Lech Walesa was an electrician. But those people don't need some lecture from me, to to make a bigger possible impact. About politics, about the importance of actually seizing power.
Having power.
Having power. Yeah. I think it's a moral imperative. Politics is for power. Politics is not for purity. There is this figure that I like to describe as the noble loser, right? The people who say, oh, you know what? I stood on the right side of history. I shouted Free Palestine every single day. I posted it. I said solidarity with trans people, blah, 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 blah. I have all the right opinions. But did you make an actual difference, right? Well, and then if not, how were you helpful? The 100 billion animals who are currently being tortured in factory farms, they don't care about the fact that you've avoided this tiny little bit of milk powder in your, I don't know, whatever product you're consuming.
You say this as a vegan, by the way. Vegan, vegetarian, yeah. Just to be clear.
They care about you actually winning. They care about you passing legislation through parliament. That is what politics is for. This is a great book with the literal title, Politics is for Power. And a lot of us have turned into political hobbyists, right? We can win the debate in the group chat. We can bully people in the comment section. But can we actually make a difference as well? And wouldn't that be nice?
This is on the book, but it's not from the book. It's a recent interview you did here in the UK. You say you're angry at friends and contemporaries for their lack of moral ambition. And this is the quote. In this book, I am talking to my own people, as you've said here already, because I'm frankly a bit angry at them. Many of us went to great universities, maybe went to Oxford or Cambridge. We were going to take on global hunger. We were going to build affordable housing. We were going to accelerate the clean energy transition. And look at us. What are we doing? Now, you've talked about some of that already. Have you had personal conversations in your own private life with friends or family members where you've said this? Because obviously you're talking in the abstract to your readership.
Sure.
But actually having a private conversation with somebody, talking like that would be quite hard for most people, right?
Yeah.
Have you ever done that?
A lot, yeah, all the time. Just today, I was doing vox pops in the city, asking bankers why they don't work on more important issues. I think it's important to make this personal.
To challenge people.
Yes. I've never found that problematic. Look, I think that moral ambition should be like 80% enthusiasm and 20% guilt and shame. But it's fine to push people a little bit, because indeed, read those application essays of people who enter Harvard or enter Oxford. It's all about how they're going to tackle tax avoidance and evasion, how they're going to solve global hunger, how they're going to prevent the pandemic. And it's just really sad what happens to most of these people. You know, McKinsey knocks on their door, the golden handcuffs arrive, and we never hear from them again. A friend of mine calls it the Bermuda Triangle of talent: consultancy, corporate law, and finance. This dark chasm that sucks up so many of our best and brightest. And look, what I've discovered is that if you really want to get on these people's nerves, you should never say something like a traditional leftist would say, like, oh, you're so evil, you're so greedy, you're so bad, you're so selfish. Doesn't work. Then they're like, you're just jealous, you can't keep up. Poor you. No, what you should say instead is like, oh, wow, you're so talented and driven, and this is what you do? Okay, well, it's a free country. Anyone can live an utterly boring life. Bye. I'm going to talk to someone else now. And that hurts, right? That is much more effective in my experience.
You quote a writer who says being on the right side of history doesn't insulate one from weak analyses.
Yeah, that's Zainab to fact sheet.
Yeah. What do you mean by that?
So she wrote about the Iraq war protests, the biggest protests in the history of the world, I think still, even bigger than the Black Lives Matter protests. And obviously it didn't prevent the war in Iraq. We have been living through a moment in history from 2006 to 2020 when, you know, there were so many more protest movements. You know, it was really the era of protest, so many people out in the streets. But then what did we get out of that? I won't say nothing, right? The Me Too movement really increased awareness around the issue of sexual harassment. Black Lives Matter increased awareness around issues of racism. But in terms of legislative results, well, maybe BLM is a particularly good example of that. You know, the results have been pretty depressing. We had the worst slogan ever with defund the police, which is utterly unpopular. Also, and maybe particularly so among communities of color who, you know, deal much more with the effects of crime. Obviously, what we needed was better policing, smarter policing, community policing. In the US, you have police officers who have maybe a couple of weeks of training, and then we give them a gun, which is utter insanity, obviously. But yeah, that is, I think, really sad. And there's a real lesson to be learned there, that there was so much energy, so much political energy as well. But what happened with it, right? What did we achieve with it?
So defund the police. I've got some colleagues at Novara Media who would agree with that. Mm-hmm. And I've got some who strongly disagree with it. And I think it's going to be the same in the comments section, even among our supporters. Somebody like Michael Walker would say, stupid slogan. Build the biggest possible coalition by using language that basically everybody agrees with. You can still have quite radical policy proposals, but
sure,
this maximalist radicalism with it rhetoric is literally pointless. But then other colleagues would say, well, look, there are these programs in the US where surplus army weapons were basically being given to local police forces. They were basically being equipped to fight an insurgency or a civil war, but these were being given to the police because of the nature of the US as an imperial power, as a military industrial power. Are you sympathetic to those second points, that the American police simply have too much firepower, too much equipment?
Oh, absolutely.
The Hummers, the helicopters.
Absolutely. But yeah, again, it comes to the question: do you actually want to achieve results, or do you want to wallow in your own purity and righteousness? What is actually effective here? And I think it was pretty clear to anyone that this was an incredibly ineffective slogan and approach to the issue. But I'm really curious what your analysis is of what has happened since the quote unquote great awakening. I did really feel that many of us utterly lost it in those years, in what was it, 2021, 22? At some point, when Roe v. Wade was taken down, you had the great pro-choice action groups like NARAL, for example, and they were all involved in internal fighting, right? Instead of actually fighting the enemy. I think it was utterly pathetic, to be honest. There was a great piece in The Intercept by Ryan Grimm about it, about at this pivotal point in human history that so many of us were fighting each other and calling each other out instead of actually building a coalition, making a difference. So I'm curious how you look at it. I guess I'm optimistic that we're now moving past it, but perhaps we still need a little bit of a reckoning of the insanity of those years.
Yeah, I wonder, because it feels almost like a religious impulse, like a puritanical impulse, you know? If we don't fully agree, if we're not entirely aligned on these 20 things, we can't work together on this one thing. Yeah. In which case, nobody will ever do anything, right? You talked about the campaign, to abolish the slave trade, 12 people. I'm sure they disagreed about a ton of other stuff. On that one issue, really aligned.
But that's any movement, right? Any effective movement is a coalition of people who deeply, strongly disagree with each other. Yeah. Helen Lewis has written a beautiful book about the women's rights movement in the UK. It was a very big coalition of women from the left to the right. For me, it was a surprise to learn that so many conservative women played an important role here because they were temperance advocates. They were against alcohol. And that was one of the main reasons why they wanted to get the right to vote, because then they could, basically go forward with prohibition. In history, this is the rule. The right things happen for the wrong reasons all the time. You got to be pragmatic. I talk extensively indeed about the abolitionist movement. A lot of vegans will say, yeah, we got to be like the abolitionists. Just keep shouting that we got to ban slavery. That's not what the real abolitionists did. Not at all. They were super pragmatic. Initially, in this country, they decided to focus solely on the slave trade and not on slavery as such, because they knew that the latter would be politically utterly impossible and toxic. So they said, you know what? We're going to first abolish the slave trade. And the main reason we're going to do that is because our boys are suffering on those voyages. They discovered that around 20% of white sailors died on these ships. And they were obviously not capital investments. They were not being owned by these captains. So it was actually quite convenient if they died, because then you wouldn't have to pay them a salary. Actually, the percentage of white sailors was higher in terms of how many died than enslaved people. Which doesn't say that I didn't know that. Was a big surprise for me as well. And I'm not saying like, they were basically the perpetrators of the system as well. Not. I'm not saying like, there's some moral equivalency here. Yeah. But I do deeply admire the pragmatism of those abolitionism to see like, hey, wait a minute. That's our argument. This is going to work in Westminster. This is how we're going to build a coalition. This is how we're going to get the Prime Minister, William Pitt, on board. And he was deeply impressed when he heard that. So that's what it takes, man. Stop gazing at your own navel and think about what actually works to help the people you care so much about.
But I think what's really fascinating with that is, if you're looking at the issue of slavery or the slave trade through the prism of capitalism, you would say the exact same economic system commodifies these people, puts them into bondage for life, dehumanizes them. The exact same economic imperative means, like you say, you don't have incentives for the people working for you to actually live. They can die as well. You can throw them overboard because, like you say, they're not capital investments. And I think it's that kind of generosity which has been an expanded understanding of how people can be exploited or oppressed under systems, which we've kind of been missing. You sort of said, well, what's my read on where it went wrong? You said we've lost it as well. Actually, let's go back to that quickly, Rutger. When did you lose it? You said 2021, 2022. Is there something that you thought you look back on and you say, actually, Rutger Bregman, I was completely wrong. I really lost the plot.
So I don't think I've ever been, one of those bullying social justice warriors. But maybe looking back on it, maybe I wish I would have been a bit braver in calling out some of the worst excesses as people were getting canceled for things that they shouldn't have been canceled for.
Like what?
I mean, we now are having this discussion around trans issues, after the ruling of the Supreme Court. I don't remember all the specific cases, but Matt D'Ancona had a great piece in the New European where, he had a whole list of examples of like really egregious things that happened to people that were treated very badly because of saying stuff that perhaps you can disagree with.
Yep.
Fine, let's have an open debate about it. But yeah, I recently had something on my own Instagram where I said something that for me is a scientific fact that, on average, there's a biological difference between men and women. And still, my replies and comment section is full of people calling me out for trans hatred. It's like that's not true. What is going wrong here? But I'm hopeful that we're moving towards a saner debate. I think one telling fact was, and again, I'm curious what you think about it, is that a lot of people have been removing their pronouns from their LinkedIn profiles. I saw that even AOC did it. And I don't have anything like against pronouns or anything like that. But I thought it was a telling thing that happened because it suggested the speed at which it was happening to me suggested to me that a lot of people didn't have those pronouns in their profile because they deeply believed in it, but because they feel pressured to put them there or in
it's
a way
the done thing,
bullied
right?
there. Yeah. So I don't know. I thought that was an interesting indication of that the pendulum is now swinging in the other direction.
Well, the classic example of this stuff. So, we've had the Supreme Court finding in this country, and it's really important to clarify a few things. So, you had the Prime Minister in this country, Keir Starmer, saying that we now know that trans women aren't women because the Supreme Court said so. That's not actually the case. It's for the purposes of the Equality Act with regards to things like single sex spaces, for the purposes of that piece of legislation. However, you have a preceding piece of legislation from 2004, which allows people to change their gender with a legal piece of, there's a legal framework to get a gender recognition certificate so that somebody who's born male or female can have a birth certificate and I believe a wedding certificate and a death certificate with a different gender on it, right? So you've got the spectacle of the literal prime minister, the man who's meant to be administering the state, saying something which is factually incorrect with regards to how the legislation works. Now, about you making transphobic comments or something, the godmother to my daughter is a trans woman, and what they would say is, I think they would actually be quite sympathetic to quite a lot of the stuff you're saying, because they would say, there was really important progressive legislation in 2004 which allowed me to change my gender and recognize that I want to live as a woman. You have a transition surgery, et cetera, although that you don't need to have that for the certificate, but that was part of her particular journey. And actually, I thought that was under threat as soon as there were clearly, and this was happening, opportunistic people that are about to go to prison saying that they don't want to go to that prison and actually they identify as a different gender and now they won't go to that prison. Now, the left, and I'm sure some of those cases were legit. I'm sure some of those are trans people who want to transition, etc. But the left instinctively was protecting those people. And what this person in my life says, actually that probably compromised really hard-won rights for people like myself. And I'm kind of sympathetic to that, actually. And there was a lack of sort of political intelligence, myself included, right? He or she without sin didn't really understand what was going on. And I think there's as a result, there's awful consequences now for trans people in this country.
Yeah.
Because people made very poor judgments on that stuff.
Yeah. I guess the question that I also ask myself, like, what happened in the US and the UK that we're now in a situation where we keep talking about the politics of toilets, right? It's pretty sad if you think about, homelessness population rising.
But they would say, a trans activist would say, sure, that was an issue that was made salient by transphobes, which I think is probably true. I agree with you. It's ridiculous that you have the Prime Minister talking about toilets. I agree with you.
Yeah.
But I don't think that was the left that was pushing that stuff.
Yeah,
the left's pushed lots of stupid stuff over the years, but I don't think that was one of them.
Yeah. So I have the perspective from the Netherlands, obviously, where the debate is much more relaxed. Like if you don't like the toilets in a certain place, then you don't go there, right? These issues are very often resolved locally, and different organizations make different decisions, and some parts of the country are more progressives and some are more conservative. But like there's no need for the Prime Minister to make statements about this. And that seems like a much more sane way to go forward, to have society, take the time to figure things out. But for some reason it became, so big here and attracted so much energy that could have been spent on other things.
Do you think, as somebody who's an outsider who's interested in progressive politics, who speaks obviously outstanding English, do you look at the UK and think, my God, you have this bizarre relationship to American political culture where you just import stuff and actually it's not remotely relevant to the material circumstances of the country?
Yeah. Well, I think that happens everywhere. So that
everywhere, not just
Europe. Yeah. I mean, we still live in a colonial imperialist world in that respect. But maybe it is worse here. that could definitely be true.
Is most charity a waste of time?
No, absolutely not. No. I'm a big fan of ambitious philanthropists who take on some of the most neglected and unpopular issues. Who funded the abolitionists? Well, not the government, not some corporate business deals. It was a small group of thoughtful and committed, brave philanthropists who very often risk their own lives by giving a lot of money to these people. In the US, you had the Secret Six, people like Garrett Smith, the richest man in New York at the time. He gave a fortune to the abolitionists. This was also true for the suffragettes, right? You had George Francis Train, who gave a lot of money to Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton to finance their own Novara media of their time, a magazine called The Revolution. Most philanthropy and charity is not very impressive, and in many cases it's just PR and BS. But luckily, there are exceptions. In my book, I also talk about the Garland Fund, which was an amazing foundation that was founded by a man named Joseph Garland, and he got an inheritance of $1 million. Initially, he said, look, I don't want the money, give it away to someone else. But then, like, all the leftists went nuts in the US. They were like, there's so much we can do with this. And at some point, he agreed to give it to a foundation under one condition, that they will give it to the most unpopular people in society. And actually, that money was used to hire the first full-time lawyer for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that laid the ground for, the final Board of Education 1956 ruling that desegregated classrooms. So it can be pretty powerful, charity and philanthropy, if you know what you're doing. But yeah, most of it is BS, giving money to already rich musea or universities that don't really need it.
So there you go. So you said, I said, is most of it a waste of time? And you said no. But then you're saying most of it is. So you've given outstanding, some outstanding examples.
Yeah. Okay, but I guess what has made me more excited about some philanthropy is that it just gives you a certain flexibility. It gives you the ability to do certain things that you otherwise would just not be able to do. I mean, Novara Media, in a way, is being financed by charity, right? I guess people are members, but they don't have to. They can consume this interview for free. Yeah. And that gives you a certain kind of flexibility and autonomy, a freedom that you otherwise wouldn't have, because otherwise you'd be utterly reliant on Google, right? And the ad revenue. So you can make content that is more critical of elites, of the establishment, because of charity. So just want to recognize that.
That's very true. No, for instance, our Palestine coverage, and I've been told this by people in various newsrooms, they couldn't cover certain things in a certain way because editorial complaints. Yeah. And that doesn't mean that, the people in charge of those newsrooms were like pro-Israel or anti-Palestine or anything, actually. There's a calculation, which is, if we go with this piece of news, I know we're going to get 500 complaints. Is it worth the hassle? Yeah. Is it worth the friction? No. And of course, Novara, we have different incentives going on. So I think that's a very good defense of charity.
Ever since I started my own organization, I've become much more interested in money. I have always loved this saying from Margaret Thatcher, who said that the Good Samaritan didn't just have good intentions, he also had money. And sometimes on the left, we like to think that money is dirty or something like that, or that everything has to look ugly or scrappy or whatever, and that we need to pay people bad wages because otherwise they're not pure enough or something like that. And that's sometimes why we keep losing, right? For example, we're taking the fight to the tobacco industry in Europe. Well, this is an $800-900 billion industry, right? You need a very well-financed operation to make a difference here, to do something that they'll be scared of. I think the same is true for you guys. If you want to achieve all your goals, you need significantly more capital. One of the things that I like about the effective altruists, for example, is that they're much more open about talking about money. When leftists talk about being a good person, they mainly talk about going to the protests, saying the right things, maybe being a member of the right organizations. But do we talk about money enough? You've got this organization called Giving What We Can, an effective altruist organization that basically says to people like, look, we think it should be a standard to donate at least 10% of your income to highly effective charities. And I get among my leftist friends, quite a bit of pushback there. Like there's a certain discomfort to talk about the money here, but for me, it's like utterly obvious. Like if we want to be serious about our ideals, we need the talent, we need the time, we need the energy, the ideas, and the money. It's pretty obvious, isn't it?
Well, I mean, Marx would say that money is social power. I mean, he talks about that in Capital. He would say, what is money? It's social power, right? And Keynes puts it really well. At the start of the 20th century, I can be reading my morning papers, buying stocks around the world. I can have a breakfast bought from, and it's all put in front of me. And the reason why is because you have this incredible token to exchange for labor and resources, which is money. It's really, really useful.
It's funny that you mentioned Marx, because the effective altruists at some point had this idea of earning to give, right? You remember that?
Yeah.
They were encouraging young people to go, work for big banks, make a lot of money, and then give it to the Against Malaria Foundation or something like that to buy malaria bed nets. Then Sam Bankman-Fried came along, and that's not looking great anymore. But it is funny that Marx and Engels did the same thing, or a similar thing.
100%.
Earning to give, right?
Yeah.
Engels was working, and therefore Marx could write Capital, right?
Yeah.
It was earning to give. So I think that the idea still makes a lot of sense. With my organization, the School for Moral Ambition, we're now launching an incubator for really driven young entrepreneurs who want to build a high growth startup that becomes really valuable. With one catch, at the beginning of it all, they pledged to donate at least 50% of the exit value, the money they make when they eventually sell the company, to highly effective charities. And I'm pretty excited about that, honestly, because if I look at some of these causes that I deeply care about, whether it's fighting for tax fairness, fighting against the tax evasion, fighting big tobacco, fighting big tech, one of the main things we're lacking here is capital, is the money to do it.
Has anybody done anything like that? Anything sort of similar-ish, or no? Is that entirely new as an idea?
Yeah, so we're cooperating with an organization called Charity Entrepreneurship that has recently rebranded as Ambitious Impact. I talk about it in the book. I like to describe it as the Hogwarts for do-gooders. And they have been doing it for nonprofits, attracting really driven, talented, mostly young people to start a very effective nonprofit, mostly working on global health. They've got some awesome examples. For example, the lead exposure elimination project that has done extraordinary work in places like Malawi, convincing the governments to get the lead out of the paint. And again, if you see the bang for the buck that they're getting in terms of how many children's lives they're saving, basically, I find it deeply impressive. But you can do the same thing for profit entrepreneurship. So they've been doing it, and we're working on it together. So anyone who's listening to this who's like, I'd love to start a company, build a very successful startup, and then get a lot of capital for important causes, well, join us.
Get in touch.
Yeah, exactly.
So I know lots of people will be listening to this or watching this and they think, oh my God, you're meant to be on the left. You're talking about business. You're talking about entrepreneurs. You're talking about capitalism. No. I just want to mention somebody who maybe you're not too familiar with. In this country, there's a very famous book, The Ragged School Philanthropist. Amazing book, one of Jeremy Corbyn's favourite books. And the Ragged Schools were founded by a man called John Pounds, who was a man in Portsmouth, 18th century. He was a shipwright, I believe. He was injured at work. He became a cobbler. And then, he committed his life basically to employing very poor children or giving them schooling. In the case of the Ragged Schools, when they got older, they would go and work for him. And he was what we would now call a social entrepreneur.
Yeah.
As well as being a businessman, very successful businessman. An extraordinary story. But I think now, myself included, by the way, often when you hear those words, you think, oh my God, lib. You know what I mean? Or that's not really like leftist radical politics. Actually, he's one of my radical heroes, right? And what he did was utterly extraordinary. But do you buy the argument at the same time? So there are some amazing social entrepreneurs like John Pounds, like the people involved in the abolition movement in the UK, 100% incredible people did incredible things. But there is also a lot of bloat in the NGO sector, right? And there's lots of people. Let's be honest. There's lots of Peter Turchin calls it, overproduction of elites, elite overproduction. And the reality is we have lots of middle class, highly intelligent kids that leave university and they go to work in the NGO sector, white collar jobs, and it's a bit of a waste of talent, right? Because we talked about the waste of talent going into management consultancy, but there's another side to it as well, or do you not buy that?
So I think here the uncomfortable fact to acknowledge is that these NGOs are not always able to attract the best people. And that is one of the reasons, is that they really have that lack of talent. They have a lot of well-intentioned people, but not always the most effective people. And the big problem also with philanthropy is that you don't really get feedback from reality. So if you mess up as a politician, then hopefully you're going to be voted out of power at some point. If you mess up as an entrepreneur, you're going to go bankrupt. But in philanthropy, you can, as long as your brochures look good and your marketing is okay, you can keep going on for a very long time. There are no feedback loops. You see, you have to organize those feedback loops yourself. You got to surround yourself with critical people, and that's the really difficult. If you manage to do it, it can be extraordinarily impactful, but it's tricky.
Yeah, there are some organizations in this country. I can think of one in particular. I won't name it. It's more than 200 years old. It's committed to prison reform. Mm-hmm. I don't think they do anything. And like, they must obviously have a lot of money over 200 years. All sorts of people have given them,
Sure,
put them in their will and whatnot.
And this is called the dead hand of philanthropy as well, is that, some very rich person gives a lot of money to an organization and then says, okay, it's got to be spent in this way. But then 100 years later, it doesn't make sense anymore. So enough criticisms of philanthropy and do-gooders to be made. My book is full of it. I guess one point in reaction to what you just said, like, ooh, lib. I've always believed that it is possible to be really radical in your end goals in politics. In Utopia for Realists, I talk about a world without borders. I've always believed that we should move towards a world without blame and punishment at some point, where we don't really, punish criminals anymore. We maybe lock them up for pragmatic reasons because of public safety or something like that. But I think the whole idea of punishment and reward is bizarre. We should move towards a much more equal and egalitarian world with a basic income for everyone, you name it. I believe all those things. But at the same time, I think if you're morally serious about actually getting there, you got to have some plan, some theory of change, and just shouting about the end goal is not going to get you there. And I ever since I started my career, I've been frustrated with a kind of academic elite that speaks in a language that most people don't really understand, that it's very insular, people debating each other as well and saying, oh, that's not the right opinion actually to have about this right now. But yeah, maybe the language bit is especially important and dear to me. Is I've always tried to write books that anyone can understand. I think that the stuff we're doing, it's not that complicated, is it? Like history, I've been trained as a historian. It's not that difficult. It's really not rocket science. But then so often I see these, so-called radical left academics talking in a language that, like, I have no idea what the fuck you're talking about. And this is like, it's such an intellectual aristocracy. And I've in all my work and my books, I've pushed against that. I think it's a moral duty to be understood by normal people with normal jobs.
Do you think that it's a major problem then for the left that our leadership, and I say this as somebody with a PhD, it's a major problem for the left that our leadership class, particularly in the UK, the US, and Western Europe, actually, it's not really the case in other countries because they have, communist one-party rule or whatever, but particularly in the advanced economies of the quote-unquote West, is it a problem that the political and ideological leadership of the left has increasingly over the last couple of decades come from the precise circles you're talking about, i.e. academia, university, professional managerial class? Is that actually a barrier to the left succeeding?
Maybe it is. I'm not sure what the direct solution is here. But there's this other book that recently came out. I forgot the author's name. The title is We've Never Been Woke. And he had, in a recent interview, he had this very vivid image of BLM protesters in New York, protesting for racial justice, but not noticing, the people of color, homeless men and women lying around them, very much in need. That is, sometimes frustrating to see, right? Things have become so insular that we have our own language and our own issues to care about and all the own right opinions, and that we sometimes find it hard to relate to real people in the real world with their real problems.
Do you think that's on purpose? Do you think that's a form of like status games that's played by people?
Yes. Henry Kissinger, I think, once said this. What was the exact quote? Like, the reason debates in academia are so vicious because so little is at stake. I've often been surprised by that. The university is actually the most neoliberal of all institutions. Like, the status games and the competition there is like, it's worse than in the worst bank, right? I think a lot of bankers at Goldman Sachs would enter in academia. It's like, oh, this is like, sorry, but this is too competitive for me. I prefer a more friendly culture that we have at the bank.
Yeah.
Isn't that bizarre?
That's wild. But you know what? Brett Christophers, who is now a geographer at the University of Uppsala, great writer, very left-wing, Marxist sort of geographical kind of methodology he has. He used to be a consultant for what is now PricewaterhouseCoopers. He told me the exact same thing. He said the most collaborative environment he's ever worked in was at Pricewaterhouse. It was called something else back then, because two companies came together. And the most sort of atomized, hyper-individualistic, hyper-competitive world he's been in is as a left-wing academic.
Yeah.
And I think, if that doesn't make you stop and think, something's gone wrong.
Yeah. That is really something to think about, like what's happened there. Yeah.
On things like food deprivation, child poverty, the world is a much better place than 35, 40 years ago. You might, the right would say market capitalism. I don't really agree with that. You might say the Chinese Communist Party, whatever. The numbers are very clear.
Yeah.
Why then are so many people black-pilled about the future, which is to say that they're doomers?
Yeah.
Why is doomerism so hegemonic? Not that everything's going well. Many things going very poorly. But there's a positive story that one can tell, but you almost never hear it, particularly from the left, but not just the left. Let's be honest. There's lots of doomerism around now. Why is that?
Everything has become Black Mirror, hasn't it? As I study history, I also see the liberating potential of technology and how it has enabled some of the greatest moral revolutions. In the book, I describe the story of Catherine McCormick, a philanthropist who inherited a huge amount of money from her husband, and then was like, okay, I'm a radical suffragette. I care deeply about women's rights. I want them to control their own fertility. But that technology simply didn't exist in the early 50s. And so she started looking for someone who could create a kind of device, maybe a pill, maybe that would give that power to women. She found a guy at Harvard, or at least he had just been kicked out of Harvard because he was too controversial. Even Planned Parenthood wouldn't finance this guy. His name was George Pincus. And he said, yeah, I probably can do it. So he invented this thing, this medicine called Innovit. And Innovit was so revolutionary, it utterly changed the world, that today we just call it the pill. And it arguably, caused or at least accelerated the second feminist wave and revolution. Just to think about what the world would have looked like today without the pill. And I still think there's that potential today. So indeed, I sometimes found it sad when I, talk to my friends on the left and they can only see the dark aspects of technology. When I just say the word tech, most people today instinctively think of billionaires shooting themselves up in space or, annoying Katy Perry's kind of, you know what I mean, right? But surely there's an alternative here, right? Technology is not just something that happens to us. It is a force that we can shape. It's something that I really liked about your book, about how we can move towards a wildly better world, not a mildly better world, but like some kind of utopia. But we need the liberating force of technology here. This is something that Marxists used to understand very, very well, didn't they? That technology would liberate us from drudgery. And maybe particularly so with AI, it's so clear to me that there's a very dark future ahead of us, potentially ahead of us. There's a scenario in which this technology is being used for the worst kind of authoritarianism with levels of surveillance that we find it hard to comprehend today. But there's also an alternative, right? There's a way or an alternative where we are actually in control and we own the robots and we finally, get to think about what life is really about. That's somewhere in his many books. I think something that Marx said as well is like, we can never solve the problems of life, but the goal of socialism is that everyone can actually face those problems, that we can all actually find out what life is actually about. Yeah. So I am deeply interested in the hopeful potential of technology. So I would love to see more white mirrors.
But where did it come from, do you think? I don't think you can look back, you can look at the 80s, you start to see lots of kind of dystopian, speculative science fiction. Is that an outgrowth of actually quite an affluent culture? You haven't got a large mammal coming after you. You haven't lost 4 kids in early years in childbirth. So we're wired to look for problems. I think there's probably something to that, right? Yeah. I don't think people realize, by the way, how much death surrounded the average person until about 150 years ago. So maybe the black pill stuff is just like, actually, there's nothing like that. So I have to create something else. Or do you think
it's also difficult to forget just how much progress we made. I was just reading the autobiography of my aunt who grew up in the 50s, and she describes when and where she was born in the east of the Netherlands and the circumstances, and the fact that her brother's cheeks got frozen during the winter, and she herself, there was no central heating, there was no washing machine, there was no dishwasher, there was no, and it's my aunt. It's not that long ago. We've made such incredible progress, materially speaking. And I think there could be much more in store of us. But I think there's definitely to that there is a certain decadence at some point that people don't really realize just how rich they've become. That's also why I have less sympathy for people saying like, look, I got to sell out. I can't, do a more morally ambitious job because I need to afford the rent. And people in the past, they could still afford the rent. And therefore, I'm like, come on, do some history, right? People were much poorer in the 60s and the 70s. But apparently we find it more difficult to make the necessary sacrifices.
I mean, Rutger, we're similar age. A century and a half ago, statistically, we'd be dead by now. Mm-hmm. Even as people in wealthy economies. I think it's Queen Anne. She was a monarch in this country, early 18th century, right at the start of the 18th century. I'm sure you've probably written about it in one of your books.
Yeah.
I think she had 16 kids. Not one survived to adulthood. Not one. And that is a couple of hundred years ago, right? And Christ, if you can't look at that sort of story, look at where we are now and be a little bit optimistic about the world. Something's gone wrong.
Yeah. The shape of human history is so weird. In the final chapter, I asked the question, what was the most important thing to happen throughout history? And I've got all these candidates, like maybe the birth of this prophet, Jesus or Buddha, or maybe it was the rise and fall of the Roman Empire or the Aztec Empire, or, you could come up with many different candidates. But then you just plot some simple graphs, like, for example, growth of world population, growth of world GDP, increase in greenhouse gas emissions. And the shape of all those graphs is very similar, right? It's the same hockey stick graph. Also for some other things, like the decline in biodiversity, for example, or also decline in extreme poverty. It all starts around 70-50. That's really when history starts. And we're still in this rocket ship that is accelerating. And we get to see probably how this story ends. It's really bizarre to wrap your head around, right? Historians often warn against chronocentrism. They say, like, look, don't make the mistake of thinking that the time in which you happen to live is the most important time ever. But when I look at those graphs, I'm like, I feel like we're in a movie and, the music is building up and, we're nearing the climax. And it could end really, really badly. And it could end really, really well. Yeah. And the outcome is probably going to be determined by a small group of really agentic entrepreneurial people who don't just complain and whine and moan, but who are like, you know what? I can find myself a small group of committed people, a cult, if you will, and make a difference and make a change.
Rutger, we're going to leave it there. Fabulous book, Moral Ambition. Buy it now. Available in all the bookstores, as well as online, but go to the bookstore.
But you guys have a bookstore. You should start your own bookstore.
Hey, you know what? We do. Yeah. Maybe we'll put it on there.
Okay.
I'm very glad you mentioned that. Rutger Bregman, thanks for coming on Downstream.
Thanks for having me.